As fighting continues in Ukraine, we bring you all the latest developments in the crisis. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of committing war crimes for bombing the city of Kharkov. Now, according to the city's mayor, at least 9 civilians have been killed, including 3 children, by Russian rocket attacks on Monday.
Російські сили сьогодні жорстоко обстріляли Харків з реактивної артилерії. Це однозначно воєнний злочин. Мирне місто, мирні житлові райони, жодного військового об'єкту. Десятки записів очевидців доводять, що це не окремий помилковий залп, а свідоме знищення людей. Росіяни знали, куди стріляють. За цей злочин точно буде трибунал. Міжнародний. Це порушення усіх конвенцій. Ніхто у світі не пробачить вам вбивство мирних українських людей.
Ukraine has also demanded that the West imposes a no-fly zone for Russian missiles, planes and helicopters in response to Russian shelling of the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. These comments come after Zelensky said he was analyzing the results of Monday's talks between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. No breakthrough came about in the meeting, and officials from both sides have gone back to their capitals for further consultations before a second round of negotiations is planned. President Putin spoke to his French counterpart and leveled his conditions to ending his offensive against Ukraine. The first was the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and the second was Western recognition of Russian sovereignty over the Crimean Peninsula. Meanwhile, Ukraine has said that the pace of Russian aggression has slowed. Satellite images have shown that Russian convoy was slowly but steadily making its way towards the capital of Kiev. The US has warned that it will impose more sanctions on Russia if Moscow continues to escalate its conflict with Ukraine, while noting that Russia has so far shown no signs of backing down. In New York, the 193-member United Nations General Assembly held a meeting on the crisis on Monday ahead of a vote this week to isolate Russia. The draft resolution already has at least 80 core sponsors, diplomats said on Monday. Over 100 countries are due to speak before the General Assembly votes.
There's an actual screenshot from someone who is there already.
As the fighting continues and tensions escalate in Ukraine, Western allies have stepped up their diplomatic campaign to try and isolate Moscow. The United Nations General Assembly convened a rare emergency special session, the first such session in 40 years and only the 11th in the United Nations history. The session opened with the members observing a minute of silence for Ukraine. The Assembly President Abdullah Shahid called for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine and for all parties to exercise maximum restraint. He also urged both sides for a full return to diplomacy and dialogue.
We are all gravely concerned about the fast deteriorating situation and ongoing military action in Ukraine. As I emphasized last week, the military offensive by the Russian Federation is a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and is inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations. Today I renew my call for an immediate ceasefire, for all parties to exercise maximum restraint and for a full return to diplomacy and dialogue.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged for fighting to stop and for all UN members to live up to the principles of the Charter. The United Nations also appointed a crisis coordinator for Ukraine and allocated $20 million for emergency operations.
Although Russian strikes are reportedly largely targeting Ukrainian military facilities, we have credible accounts of residential buildings, critical civilian infrastructure, and other non-military targets sustaining heavy damage. This escalating violence, which is resulting in civilian deaths, including children, is totally unacceptable. Enough is enough.
A day after Russia put its nuclear deterrence forces on high alert and Belarus renounced its non-nuclear status, United Nations Secretary General said that the idea of a nuclear conflict is inconceivable.
Fighting in Ukraine must stop. It's raging across the country from air, land, and sea. It must stop now. Russian missile and air bombardments have been pounding Ukrainian cities day and night. The capital, Kyiv, is encircled from all sides. In the face of the continuing attacks, Kyiv's 3 million residents are being forced to seek safety in their homes, improvised bomb shelters, and the city's subways. The Ukrainian government has distributed a meaningful number of arms to the population with the stated objective to participate in the defense of the country.
Opening his address at the General Assembly, the Ukrainian ambassador waved a screenshot from his phone showing what he claims is a conversation of a soldier with his mother, where the soldier informs his mother that there are civilians throwing themselves before tanks. Ukrainian ambassador accused Russia of killing hundreds of Ukrainians. The ambassador added that Russia is mounting an offensive while negotiations are still underway. Ukraine also called Russia's nuclear alert threat madness. Well, for more on this, WION correspondent Susan Tehran is now joining us live from New York. Good to see you, Susan. These sessions will now be common for the time being. One message is clear: let peace prevail. What more can you tell us about what was discussed in this special session?
Right. You know, generally the United Nations General Assembly is not an action committee. However, it does make certain decisions. And one of those decisions is to really agree on a budget, notably humanitarian budgets for countries in need in dire times. And I think that's why Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, really talked about the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and talked about how so far $20 million has been allocated from the emergency budget at the United Nations to Ukraine, and more needs to be done. Member states need to step up and do more, as we saw on the part of the President of the General Assembly as well. The thematic message really was the war needs to stop. These emergency sessions, really, when the Security Council tosses them to the General Assembly, it is for the UN General Assembly to provide recommendations to member states on ways to provide peace and security in times of conflict and in these times. And while, you know, these resolutions at the UN are non-binding, these condemnations do carry weight at the end of the day. For example, in 2014, if there wasn't a vote put forth regarding Russia's invasion of Crimea, then the recognition of Crimea on the part of Russia might have, you know, become official. The General Assembly prevented that. Another case, for example, regarding for example, in 1960, I just want to let you know that South African delegation from the United Nations was suspended because of apartheid, and then in 1994, because of its democratic transition, it was allowed back in. Similar happened in Yugoslavia. Countries could lose their seats. So we'll see how severe, situations unfold regarding Russia. But this was a meeting really for the international community to come together, albeit, we saw in the Security Council that there really wasn't a unified voice. There were countries that were still calling for a cessation of violence. They were calling for peace, but they also decided not to take sides.
Susan, do we have any new updates from the White House on the Ukraine crisis apart from sanctions announcements?
So we did hear that everything is on the table, nothing is off the table, and so far the sanctions have focused really on the banking system. I think the major issue right now is on Russia's oil and gas sector, something that a lot of lawmakers on Capitol Hill are waiting perhaps to see whether or not the United States will take unilateral action against that. But the issue with that is something that the UN the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations also mentioned during an interview is that the Biden administration is wary right now because it's also an importer of Russian gas. Remember, that at 500,000 barrels a day. It doesn't want to jack up prices here in the United States, but moving forward, yes, they did say that they will impose more sanctions if necessary.
Live from New York, Susan Teherani, thank you very much for your insights and for talking to us today. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.